does a great honour to introduce Dr. Jack Hunter, who's with us here to the Alumni Association to talk about deep weird. Now, Dr. Hunter has published well over 80 articles, mainly on the area of parapsychology and anthropology of spiritual matters. So a very broad brush of interest, but a real expertise in these areas. As we all know, he now tutors and lectures with our MA, but also with the MA in Ecology and Spirituality. I think that's right, isn't it, Jack?
Yep.
And you founded the Afterlife Research Centre, or co-founder with that, and you co-edit the most wonderful journal, Time and Mind, which I would recommend to anybody. It's a journal of archaeology, consciousness and culture. So it's definitely a good read there. But we're really looking forward to what you have to say tonight, which is for our audience here on Deep Weird. Everyone, Dr. Jack Hunter.
Lovely, thank you very much. Well, it's nice to be here, and it's nice to be connecting with people all over the world and getting this opportunity to talk about the deep weird with like-minded people, I think. So I'll just explain a little bit about where this talk came from, because actually it's based on an article that I wrote earlier this year that was published in this issue of the Journal for the Study of Religious Experience, which was a 50th anniversary celebratory issue of the Alister Religious Experience Research Centre, which is also housed in Lampeter. And the theme for the conference last year, which I didn't actually attend, but I ended up editing this journal together for the research centre. But the theme was the future of the study of religious and spiritual experience. So I was thinking about, what are some of the ways that the study of religious and spiritual experience can be expanded? And actually, I've been thinking about this for quite a long time. Most of my work has been in this kind of area. So this paper really kind of springs out of this article that I wrote for the Alister Hardy journal. Okay. And here is how I've structured it. So I'm going to first of all give us an introduction. I'm going to explain, a little bit about different forms of research on extraordinary experience, and then I'm going to delve into we'll find out where the term comes from later on. But this idea of high strangeness, we'll explore what that is, what I mean when I use that term, and why I think actually it's a useful term, for academic use as well. Then we're going to look at this excellent concept of Boggle thresholds. I'll explain where this idea comes from as well, and also look at some of the reasons why these thresholds might actually be put up on purpose. So hopefully that'll become clear later on, and the different ways that academic research actually filters out certain kinds of anomalous experiences. The third part then will delve back into the phenomenology of paranormal extraordinary experiences. We'll think about the numinous, the weird, and the Oz factor, and explore how these different ideas, or they're basically labels for feeling responses, how these might interact with each other. And then in the last section, I want to think about ways that we can actually engage with this stuff. So thinking about different theoretical frameworks for thinking about the deep weird. And the conclusion will just sort of summarize everything. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so let's delve in. So the first part, we want to think about the history of extraordinary experience research. Okay, the interesting thing about extraordinary experiences is that very often they seem to imply some kind of another world, or a spiritual realm, or the survival of the body after death. So it's kind of like a controversial area in many ways. It's kind of like it's always been quite fringy. But that said, there has been, and there still is, a strong academic lineage, and it goes, usually if you're reading a textbook on the history of religious experience research, it'll take you at least as far back as William James. So William James is kind of like one of the pioneers of this field. But we could also take it back to the work of people like Henry Sidgwick here. He was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Sidgwick later on. But he started to bring a sort of a scientific approach to the study of paranormal experiences, or psychical experiences as they called them. Okay, then we've got William James, like I've said, in 1902. His most influential, most famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, was published. That's another thing I should have said about this paper. It also forms the rationale for a book that I'm working on at the moment called Deep Weird, on the varieties of high strangeness experience. And it's going to kind of be riffing off this varieties of religious experience idea, because hopefully when the book appears next year, it's the 120th anniversary of the publication of Varieties of Religious Experience. So this idea of the deep weird is kind of like an expansion or an add-on to William James's approach, looking at all of the varieties of religious experiences. So yeah, we can take it back. We can talk about Alister Hardy as well, founder of the Alister Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre. He was a marine biologist to begin his career, but he always also had a lifelong fascination with spiritual experiences. And he brought, again, this naturalistic, scientific kind of approach to the study of the paranormal and extraordinary. And this work continues today with the work of people like Bettina Schmidt in the Religious Experience Research Centre, and lots of new work trying to firm up the methodologies, really, for studying these things. Okay, so there is this strong lineage. It's a scholarly lineage of taking extraordinary experiences seriously. But there's also another field that kind of runs parallel to this kind of academic religious experience research. And the two fields actually don't very often come together, although I think, thankfully, at the moment, that's starting to change. And there is starting to become much more dialogue between religious studies scholars and parapsychologists. And just last week, the Parapsychological Association had a symposium on the study of religion and parapsychology. So this dialogue is starting to happen, which is really interesting. But parapsychology has tended to approach extraordinary experiences from a very different kind of perspective. People like William James were kind of cataloging experiences, interviewing people maybe, especially the work of the SPR, interviewing people about their hallucinations and things. Whereas parapsychology is much more interested in trying to verify the existence of what they call psi phenomena. Psi is the label that they give to things like telepathy, psychokinesis, all of that kind of stuff. So parapsychology, really, in an effort to try and make this field of research as scientific as possible and to be accepted as a science, adopted this laboratory-based approach. And it became very much focused on statistical evidence. Statistical evidence is held up as like the benchmark, for scientific proof, or maybe not proof, but, as near to proof as we can get. So, they adopted all of these processes and these scientific methods and techniques and theories in order to make this field of research as scientific as possible. But it's still been on the kind of fringe. Parapsychology, even today, is a fairly fringe subject. Although, interestingly, there is funding from big, like medicine funding, that kind of thing, for parapsychology available. I've been contacted by some people about it, which is interesting. So there's definitely like interest in it, but it has always been on the fringe. And the other thing about parapsychology is that it's collected a lot of pretty good statistical evidence in favor for a variety of psi phenomena. And by the standards of most sciences, these phenomena are demonstrated statistically. They're small effects, but they're statistically significant effects. So by any other standard, they exist, but there's still a lot of backlash against them because of the implications, I think. But there's another problem here as well. All of this statistical evidence for the paranormal, for psi phenomena, really pales in significance, when you look at the way that paranormal experiences manifest in the real world or in people's real experiences. So things like veridical hallucinations or crisis apparitions, when someone is in trouble somewhere else, and then someone has a vision of that person, and they know that they need to go and help them. And there are many documented cases of this. These kinds of experiences are powerful and intense and very often emotional. They're to do with loved ones and that kind of thing, to do with life and death. So how can, the statistical evidence seems very far removed from that. So it's almost like they're studying something, although it's clearly related in some way to these paranormal experiences, it's also quite far detached from them, or from the way that psi actually manifests in the real world. And that's one of the things that I've been most interested in, is thinking about how can we study these processes which have been demonstrated in the laboratory, but in the real world setting. And that's why I think anthropology is particularly good for that. So yes, but this is a problem. Statistical effects are so small compared to most paranormal experiences, which are life-changing events for people. So I want to think about where the connection is. People like William James recognized the life-changing capacity of these experiences. So where's the linkage between that and the research in parapsychology? And there's also another field of paranormal or extraordinary experience research, which is labeled Fortean. And it's named after Charles Fort, who was a writer, kind of like at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And he collected all sorts of accounts of weird phenomena, strange things, not all paranormal, some, like fish falling from the sky and things like that, just these oddities, and collected them all together in 3 books, amazing books that he published. The first one was the Book of the Damned. And that's where he lays out his kind of philosophical approach to these things, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But Fort's books influenced other people to research the paranormal. But obviously, these people are operating in their own domain. They're not academics. They haven't been constrained by dominant academic ideas or dominant academic structures. Obviously, they are riffing on them and thinking about them and interacting with them, but they're not academics themselves. So they've got much more freedom. And Charles Fort, played with that freedom a lot. He came up with all sorts of wild theories for, to explain these phenomena, but then he would dismiss them and move on to the next one, because the joy for him was in thinking about the possibilities. But I think amongst those possibilities that he thought of, there are nuggets of very interesting ideas that can be applied in the academic sphere as well. So we'll get onto that later on as well. Other people, notable Forteans, are John Keel. He was most well known for his work with UFOs and things like that in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s. But he introduced lots of really interesting concepts into the study of the paranormal, which shake up our thinking about these things. So, for instance, the dominant view of UFOs, always and still today, is that they are extraterrestrials from another planet. But John Keel came up with some other ideas. He posited this idea of ultra-terrestrials, that these are not from another planet, but they are actually manifestations of the Earth. That they are an Earth-based phenomenon. They're actually ultra-terrestrial, and probably have been going on since before, humans were here. Okay, so this an interesting idea. It totally turns things on its head, and in this grand scheme of possibilities, it's entirely possible, and it adds an interesting perspective to thinking about old problems. Other ideas that he came up with were the superspectrum, which was his suggestion that just how light is a spectrum of colors, how there are like other worlds essentially that exist along a spectrum like that, and it's just grades of difference between them. And he suggested that maybe UFOs and other sorts of monsters and things existed on other levels of this spectrum. So they're not supernatural. They're actually, in fact, part of nature, part of the world. And another of his interesting ideas is window areas, which he noticed that if you, when, through his cataloging of all of these paranormal experiences and encounters and things, that there were certain areas that were like hot spots. Because this is all really useful stuff. And I think it's strange that academia doesn't engage with this stuff, especially academic research that is concerned with, religious experiences or extraordinary experiences, encounters with angels and all of that kind of stuff. So the question is, one of the questions is, where do we draw the line between, like the academic lineage that we talked about with William James and all of that kind of stuff, and then the parapsychological research, and then the Fortean, more kind of popular paranormal research? And what about ghost hunting and all those kind of things? So, where do we draw the line? Or is there even a line? I don't think there is. But more importantly, is there some way that we can kind of like build a bridge between academic, parapsychological, and Fortean perspectives and their insights? So that's kind of what this paper is about, and what the book ultimately is about as well. Thinking about all of these interconnections. So we're going to delve in a little bit deeper now, deeper into the weird, and think about this concept of high strangeness, which is a really useful idea, I think. But first, I have to just recap a little bit. I was saying before that parapsychology brings these experiences into the lab and kind of sterilizes them in a way and turns them into a statistical, effect. But writing as far back as the 1960s, the Italian anthropologist Ernesto Di Martino, he's not that well known in the English-speaking world because not many of his books have actually been translated into English, but some of them have. And I found this amazing book that he wrote. I think it was earlier than 1968, but it was translated into English in 1968, where he explored the links between anthropology and parapsychology in a wonderful way. But he pointed out in this book, and this is, I think, one of his key points, is that in the laboratory, this is what I've already said, but he's saying it much more nicely than me. In the laboratory, the drama of a dying man who appears to a relative or friend is reduced to an oft-repeated experiment, one that tries to transmit to the mind of a subject the image of a playing card chosen at random. So, he pointed this out, and he said this is the contribution that anthropology can make to parapsychology. Which, I'm coming at this as an anthropologist, is that we can start to think about these experiences not in a lab, but in an ecologically valid context. So in the flux and flow of people's everyday lives and in all the emotion and that kind of thing. So from this idea then, that the real life extraordinary experiences are much more intense. I'm going to take you to this guy, Mike Cleland. Mike Cleland, I think we could classify him, thinking of the three different classifications as a Fortean writer on the paranormal. He's not an academic, but he does good research, and he's an experiencer himself. He has had UFO encounters, but strangely intertwined with these experiences, synchronistic meetings with owls. So this spurred him on to write this really great book that explores all of these weird owl themes that run through the UFO abduction literature, and also the experiences of people. But at the very beginning of the book, he makes a nice point about this, the complexity of these paranormal experiences as they occur in real life. He says that real life paranormal experiences are often enmeshed in a tangled knot of implausibility. So it's not often, like you might see like a UFO and then that's it in your life. Actually, that experience is probably a part of many other kinds of experiences. And for a lot of people, these experiences are interlinked in some way as well. Okay, so he goes on, he says, synchronicity spills over the edges like an unattended sink. So in the flux of everyday life, of real life, these experiences are much more entangled, if that makes sense, much more chaotic as well than academic compartmentalization. So we'll see now how chaotic it actually is. But he takes this, though, as a sign to trust the event as legitimate, or the experience as legitimate. The more complicated the interwoven details, the more valid it seems. So he's using actually the complexity of these experiences as a benchmark for, evaluating them, which is an interesting approach as well. Because we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but in academia, the tendency is to go for the simplest or the most clear cut, so you can put together nice categories of experiences. But actually, in the real world, they're much more intermingled. Okay, so in Fortean writing, then, this complexity is referred to as the high strangeness factor. So you can talk about, you can have an experience that has a low strangeness, like a relatively mundane experience, or you could have a high strangeness experience that has all of this synchronicity and stuff interspersed within it. So we actually get the term high strangeness from Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was an astronomer, and that's where his academic career was. But he became involved in the official Project Blue Book research on UFOs, the US military, Air Force. And he was the guy basically that was sent out to investigate when UFO sightings were reported to the military. And if they were good enough, if they passed his test and things, then, they would go into Project Blue Book, which is the report on these UFOs. But the overall, I think Project Blue Book says that, generally most of these experiences or reportings could be explained away, but there's a very slim percentage of them that couldn't be explained. And often these most unusual ones are the high strangeness ones, the ones that can't be explained. Okay, so here we go. He was the scientific advisors to the Air Force's UFO projects, all of these different things. So he was, about as a mainstream a UFO researcher as you can get, as legitimate as you can be. Okay, so from his research, he came up with this idea of a strangeness rating for experiences. So I'll read you what he said. A light seen in the night sky, the trajectory of which cannot be ascribed to a balloon, aircraft, etc., would nonetheless have a low strangeness rating, because there's only one strange thing about the report to explain its motion. A report of a weird craft that descended within 100 feet of a car on a lonely road, caused the car's engine to die, its radio to stop, and its lights to go off, left marks on the nearby ground, and appeared to be under intelligent control, receives a high strangeness rating, because it contains a number of separate, very strange items, each of which outrages common sense. Okay, so this is quite a handy tool, really, for thinking about experiences. We can say some experiences have got a low strangeness rating and some have got a high strangeness rating. Later on, computer scientist Jacques Vallée, he worked with Allen Hynek, here he is with Allen Hynek, and expanded it, and he came up with 7 different levels, or 7 different levels of strangeness, essentially, ranging from a light scene, the lowest level, all the way up to level 7, which was the psychic kind of UFO experiences, where you have dream encounters with aliens and things combined with lights in the sky and other strange stuff, weird synchronicities. So it's a spectrum. High strangeness is a spectrum. Another interesting theoretical framework that we can use for thinking about this weirdness is the idea of the trickster. And there's an amazing book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, by a parapsychologist called George Hansen. It was published in 2001, but it is excellent. I really recommend it. And he brings in, he comes from a much more, relative to me, a much more like structural anthropological angle. He's well into Levi-Strauss and that kind of thing. But he really shows this, how anthropology can reveal interesting things about the paranormal. And his main point is that the paranormal, whether we're talking about parapsychological phenomena like psi or telepathy or PK, or whether we're talking about monsters or other weird paranormal encounters, it seems to exhibit a trickster-like quality and a tendency to collapse any kind of neat frameworks, which is why academia struggles, I think, with it a lot. So this is from an obituary that he wrote for the psychical researcher D. Scott Rogo, who was, sad story, D. Scott Rogo was actually murdered in his home, quite young as well. But he was an interesting parapsychologist because he was interested in exploring, not just the laboratory stuff, but also the weirder fringes as well. So this is how George Hansen summarizes that work. He says, demonic experiences, Bigfoot sightings, poltergeist action, and phenomena suggesting survival of bodily death have all been reported in conjunction with UFOs. Strange animal mutilations have been reported in poltergeist cases, as well as with UFO sightings. Striking ESP experiences have been reported by UFO contactees. Some of the contactees claim bedroom visitations by angels, extraterrestrial aliens, and mythical creatures. Similar experiences have been reported for thousands of years. These are unsettling claims not only because of their innate strangeness, but also because they fall between the discrete categories most people assume to be valid. And thus most researchers, even those in parapsychology, prefer to ignore them. Okay, so he's basically saying, these weird experiences that people actually quite frequently report, most researchers, even parapsychologists, are going to kind of steer clear from them. They're much more likely to investigate a clean poltergeist case, for example, or a clean alien abduction case. When you start to bring in mediums and other stuff, then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, hang on a minute. Okay, so this is an interesting feature of the paranormal that is actually well known in the Fortean community, but not so much in the academic community. So here's a couple of interesting examples of current Fortean writers, or a current Fortean writer, Joshua Cutchin, and the way that his explorations of this interconnectedness kind of, I think, offer a new perspective, for research in other areas of extraordinary experience, like religious experience. So, for example, this book, The Brimstone Deceit, is a study of the role of smells in different paranormal experiences, all sorts of different kinds of experiences. But you'll see in a minute, when we look at academic research on extraordinary experience, it usually focuses on visual things, auditory things, tactile things, but never on smell. And he does an excellent job of exploring the role of smell, and it's reported in lots of experiences, but rarely is it discussed or mentioned. But there are interesting things like the smell of brimstone and all that kind of stuff, the smell of sulfur, that occur in all sorts of different paranormal experiences, from ghost sightings all the way through to UFO landings and things like that. So, that perspective is a novel perspective, but it shows again these weird interconnections between experiences that we previously maybe thought of as completely unrelated to each other. And the same goes for his book, The Trojan Feast, which looks at folkloric stuff, but also experiences of where food and drink are involved. There's some kind of an exchange of food. So fairies will try to get you to eat the fairy food. The stories of UFOs landing and trying to, getting people to eat weird pancakes and stuff like that. Bigfoot, likes to come and take food offerings from the porch of people's houses. So there's a strange sort of fairy UFO Bigfoot crossover thing that he's really been exploring as well. And so this is just, common knowledge in the Fortean world. But when it comes to actually academic research on extraordinary experience, we tend to think in I call it like a phenomenological silo. Okay. So although these connections are well tested in Fortean literature, academic literature seems to ignore them. So we look at, for example, you'll have someone who researches out-of-body experiences, and then another person will be researching near-death experiences. Someone else does ghosts. Someone else's job is mediumship, and you've got the UFO guys and the fairy guys. And And then you've got the academic religious experience researchers who are doing their thing, but not communicating in any way. But, you know, it's clear to see that there are lots of interesting connections. So I'm suggesting that, you know, this high strangeness thing, this interconnected thing, actually runs not just through the paranormal and, you know, the weirder side of things, but also into the religious and the mystical and all of that kind of stuff that's kind of well established in academia. So yeah, this is the question then. Why is all of this stuff ignored in academic writing? So this takes us into our next part, Boggle thresholds. So this idea of a Boggle threshold is a great term. It's a lovely term. Was coined by the historian of psychical research, Renee Haynes. She, you know, was interested in the history of parapsychology and psychical research. And she came up with this idea, basically to suggest that, you know, everyone has their own kind of limit. And to some extent, that limit is imposed on us by our culture and our norms and values and all of that kind of stuff. But also we have our own individual, you know, psychological makeup, which makes us easier, you know, more or less capable of dealing with weirdness, basically. Some people have got a high threshold for weirdness and they can let a lot in. And some people have got a low threshold and they don't want to let any weirdness in. So this threshold then is the point at which an experience or a phenomenon is thought to be so outlandish and unlikely or weird that it's completely dismissed by a researcher or anyone. So she says, individual Boggle thresholds will vary with individual temperament, history, training, and aptitude. They will also be influenced by those of the groups to which each individual is linked: family, friends, school, employment, university. In people brought up in the discipline of the physical sciences, the levels of Boggledom are likely to differ considerably from the levels found in those brought up in the humanities. Okay, so, you know, talking to a humanities audience today is very different to talking to, you know, a physical sciences audience. And the way that we think about these things is very different. We have different Boggle thresholds just on a disciplinary basis, but also obviously on our individual psychological level as well. So, but, you know, this is obviously kind of problematic because these thresholds are very subjective and we might be putting a limit on something that actually, although it's a very strange experience, you know, very strange experience, is a part of that experience fundamentally, and we're ignoring it because it doesn't fit into our model, or it challenges a dominant you know, theory or framework. So we want to think a little bit about how to step beyond these Boggle thresholds. And I think one of the ways that we can do that, like I just suggested at the beginning, is to look at, you know, paranormal writers outside of academia is one way of doing it. And also I'll talk a little bit later about different frames of mind that we can adopt when we're doing research, which can help us a little bit. So I think there are ways to step beyond the Boggle threshold, but it's tricky. And obviously we have them for a reason as well. So these Boggle thresholds can be deliberate. So, you know, there might be a specific reason why you're putting a threshold. Say you're doing a study on a particular kind of religious experience. You might want to say, well, we only want to research this one. So we're going to put a limit on the kinds of experiences. Say we're researching near-death experiences and someone sends you an angel encounter, you know, maybe you want to leave it out because it doesn't quite fit into what you're interested in. And a lot of academic research projects have done that in their studies of anomalous experiences. So here's Henry Sidgwick again, one of the founders of the SPR. And in the late 1800s, they did an amazing study, the Census of Hallucinations. And they used this question, which, you know, research methodologists call this a filter question, because it filters, it deflects away certain people and it only brings certain people in. So their question was, have you ever, when believing yourself to be completely awake, and this is one of the key points, completely awake, had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched by a living being or inanimate object, or of hearing a voice which impression so far as you could discover was not due to any external physical cause. Okay, so this is their question. And in an article about their census, Henry Sidgwick explains that this last sentence is intended to exclude as far as possible a class of experiences which are liable to confound with hallucinations. And specifically, he goes on to mean sort of like dream experiences and things like that. So they're making a choice to exclude certain kinds of experiences because, you know, they want it to be academic and neat and tidy, basically. But, you know, it's also problematic because there's a lot of research, you know, subsequently, and maybe these guys would have picked up on it, to show that, you know, in sleep states, paranormal experiences are extremely common, and sleep states are associated with higher scoring in, you know, ESP laboratory tests and all sorts of things. Okay, so they're kind of they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. You can see why, because you don't want to have a project that's way too, you know, too much to handle, but also it's problematic. It's getting rid of those kinds of experiences that fall between the gaps and that don't neatly fall into, you know, an either or of the categories. Alister Hardy, when he did his research, did a similar kind of thing. They used, again, a filter question, to stream the responses that they got. This was his question. It's called the Alister Hardy question, and there's lots of interesting research, you know, using the question in different cultural contexts and trying to find out whether it is actually a useful question or not. But here it is. Have you ever been aware of or influenced by a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, which is different from your everyday self? This is a bit broader now, but it's still, you know, it's to do with a sense of presence or a sense of power. And interestingly, in spite of using this filter question, Alister Hardy, in an interview, went on to say that, you know, even though they put this filter question in, accounts of the more ecstatic experiences kept coming in. They kept coming in, really crazy experiences, you know, things that they didn't really want. So they had to make a choice, and he did make a choice that they would include those experiences in the archive. So today, in the archive, there are over 6,000 accounts. It's a very eclectic thing. There are lots of different kinds of experiences. And, you know, it's a religious experience archive, but some of these experiences don't sound very much like classical religious experiences, you know, like ecstatic visions or things like that. They sound a lot more like UFO encounters or fairy encounters and things like that. So I've got a couple of examples, things like of those anomalies to think about in a minute. Okay, so this is just a little point about these questions, these filter questions then, a methodological point from David Humane, a sociologist. He says, by using a closed-ended question as a filter, qualitative researchers run the risk of filtering out those who do not understand their experiences in the terms given by the researcher. So, you know, there's an issue there, isn't there, of how to be inclusive enough that you're getting all of the information that you need and all of the experiences that are relevant, but also kind of trying to stay academic and compartmentalized. So there have been lots of studies of these experiences, and in particular of the ones collected in the Religious Experience Research Centre's archive. One of these studies was published by Timothy Beardsworth in 1977. And he looked at the first 1,000 accounts in the archive. So he had, you know, the first 1,000 accounts in his lap, look through them and see what's there. But he explains how he then goes about doing that. And you can see, you know, we were talking about smell earlier on, but, you know, there's no smell included here. So he's leaving out something already. The episodes I shall quote involve sensory phenomena. Smell is a sense. Visions, voices, and the like. I classify the phenomena under separate headings according to the sense involved: visual, auditory, tactile, inward sensations. there is also the sense of a presence, the feeling that someone is there based on no sensory evidence at all. This feeling, I think, so far as being out on a limb, somehow underlies the other sensory categories. I'm not having a go at this guy's work. I think it's really good, but it does do something. It misses out on something, which you'll see in a minute. And then there are further subcategories that he goes through. Things like visions, illumination of surroundings, lights and things like that. Feeling of unity with one's surroundings. These are like mystical type experiences, outer body experiences, and transformations of the surroundings, which are like, extroverted mystical experiences and that kind of stuff. So this book is full of, proper extraordinary experiences, which is great. But he seems to have chosen certain kinds of experiences. And I think I'll show you why I think that in a minute. But these are the kinds of standard experiences that are reported in the book. It's a genuinely anomalous, extraordinary experience, but it is actually a fairly ordinary, extraordinary experience. So here it is. There was no sensible vision, but the room was filled by a presence which in some strange way was both about me and within me. I was overwhelmingly possessed by someone who was not myself, and yet I felt I was more myself than I had ever been before. Okay, so these kinds of experiences, there are many experiences like this in the archive. They're extraordinary experiences for the people involved. They're often life-changing, transformative experiences for them, obviously. But this is a fairly kind of safe experience. It's a standard type of experience, and it's kind of like an academically acceptable type of experience. It's one that fits nicely into the categories that we already have. So when I came to look at the archive, I thought I'm going to try and look at the archive through kind of like Fortean goggles and see what other kinds of weird experiences are in there. And one of the experiences that I found, I've included this picture from Twin Peaks because it's got a kind of Twin Peaksy vibe, this experience. This is number 235. So this experience would have been included in the first 1,000 accounts looked at by Timothy Beardsworth in his study, of sensory experiences, senses of presence. But this is the experience that was reported. On the Friday, a man came to clean the carpet and curtains in the drawing room. Later on, there was a complete fusing of everything electrical. Clocks, radios, refrigerator, freezer, TV, all the lights, etc. In the evening, I lay down on the sofa, closed my eyes and tried to relax. I then saw several little green men with very unpleasant expressions. They were looking at me. They seemed to be at a distance. I suppose gnomes or goblins would be an adequate description. I didn't like what I saw, and I was reminded at the time I had a rheumatic illness when I was 7 and had been very alarmed by the little green men I had seen then. Hallucinations, presumably. So this is a weird experience. I couldn't find it referenced in or referred to in Timothy Beardsworth's book, although clearly it falls within his first, the first 1,000 accounts. So the question is, why did this particular experience not make it into his academic study? It is a sense of presence like he was researching, except the sense of presence is of weird little green goblin men. It's not a sense of Jesus or an angel or, some kind of a religious figure or anything like that. It's something else and something a bit weird. Okay, so we could say that this experience has got a high strangeness rating. And then because of its high strangeness rating, maybe then it exceeded Timothy Beardsworth's Boggle threshold. So he excluded it from his study. But the interesting thing about this experience, when we start to look at it in a comparative perspective, I should say, actually, they become damned data then. This damned facts, this is what Charles Fort called these phenomena that science ignores. So, it becomes a damned piece of data. It's no use to anyone anymore. Well, actually it is, but it's ignored. So, but when we start to look at this kind of experience comparatively, we start to see interesting features that connect it with other pretty well documented elements of the phenomenology of not only other high strangeness experiences, but also of pretty well established, religious experience kind of feelings as well. So, some of the ones I've highlighted here, I'll talk about in a minute. So this guy coming to clean the carpets, I mean, obviously this was included for a reason, but we're not told who this person is. It's mysterious, and it starts to sound a little bit, as we'll see, like a Men in Black experience. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a Men in Black encounter or a Man in Black encounter, but I'll explain that later on. But they turn up at weird times, and they're very strange, and strange things happen after they've gone as well, like the fusing of electrical equipment. This is well known if you're a ghost hunter, taking electrical equipment to a haunted house in pretty much every time the battery's going to run out. I had an experience like that myself when I went to the Arthur Findlay College, which is the headquarters of the Spiritualist National Union. And I took my camera with me, and I went to the shop and bought brand new batteries, put them in my camera, checked it was okay. And then when I came to take photos, there was no charge in the battery. So I didn't get any photos of the place, which was a shame. But this is a common paranormal thing. The little green men. Well, recently there was an amazing study published, the Fairy Census, published by the Fairy Investigation Society and the folklorist Simon Young. And they collected accounts of contemporary fairy experiences. And they collected a lot of them. And a lot of those experiences are quite similar in a lot of ways to this kind of experience. Okay, so there's these strange parallels, which are interesting, but it suggests that, this is not something necessarily that someone's just made up, because all of the things that they're saying fit into the narratives around these experiences, which is super interesting. So this is where we're entering then into the kind of the phenomenology of these experiences, what they feel like when they happen to people. So we're going to think about the numinous, the weird, and the Oz factor now. So start off with the numinous, because Rudolf Otto, again, is a well-established figure in the study of religious experience, well respected, kind of like another founding father kind of figure. He's a good, what's the word, like a benchmark or something, like a grip to hang on to. Because he's so foundational. But actually, when you read what he's saying some extremely weird stuff. The numinous itself is very, very weird. And actually, the idea of the numinous encapsulates a lot of the kind of high strangeness experiences that we've been talking about. So he came up with this idea of the numinous, which was, for him, the very essence of religion. It's the foundational impulse. This feeling, he called it a feeling response that we have at certain times. It's a religious experience. And he said there are two strands of this. There's the mysterium tremendum, which is the terrifying, frightening. He even uses the term mysterium horrendum, horrifying mystery, which is frightening to behold. And then the mysterium fascinans, which is awe-inspiring and wonderful, and it draws you in, you want to look at it. So the numinous is a combination of these experiences of being terrified and being thoroughly enthralled by the experience, of seeing it as a wonderful thing, as a magical thing, but also being afraid of it on a very deep, visceral kind of, he called it like an animal response level. This feeling is a very primal feeling. He also goes on to suggest that this sense of the numinous is conjured through our interactions with what he calls the holy other, something which has no place in our scheme of reality, but belongs to an absolutely different one. It's an interesting point because we could think about reality and nature and that kind of thing, but we won't go there at the moment. Just that this idea of encountering the holy other, or something new and terrifying, but also fantastic. You can't stop yourself but look at it, but you're also kind of don't want to look at it. And he said this is like the God experience, or the mystical union experience. And, you know, there's always that tension of like losing yourself in it and being dissolved and gone, and it actually being a void, but also being beautiful and amazing at the same time. Okay, so here he is describing this feeling. The feeling of it may at times come sweeping like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with a tranquil mood of deepest worship. It may burst in sudden eruption from the depths of the soul with spasms and convulsions, or lead to the strangest excitements, to intoxicated frenzy, to transport and to ecstasy. It has its wild and demonic forms and can sink to an almost grisly horror and shuddering. It may become the hushed trembling and speechless humility of the creature in the presence of that which is a mystery inexpressible. I like that. Okay, so this is a feeling response that human beings can have. And in a minute, I'm going to look at a couple of examples of high strangeness experiences that really resonate with this numinous idea, and especially with this idea of there being a sort of a spectrum of horror and delight. Another way that this feeling has been described is as the weird, a weird feeling. Mark Fisher, who was a sort of a cultural theorist, who passed away a couple of years ago, he wrote a great book about the weird and the eerie, and he defines them as two related but quite distinct forms of experience or feeling response. And it's interesting because he's writing about weird fiction like H.P. Lovecraft and all of that kind of stuff, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But those authors, their work kind of, in order to be effective, you know, horror stories, they have to conjure that feeling of the weird in the reader as well, which is interesting. So anyway, he defines the weird, and you can see that this sounds quite a lot like the numinous as well. The weird is a particular kind of perturbation. It involves the sensation of wrongness. A weird entity or object is so strange that it makes us feel that it should not exist, or at least it should not exist here. Yet if the entity or object is here, then the categories which we have up until now used to make sense of the world cannot be valid. So, you know, this is like when you have a vision at the foot of your bed of an angel standing there. You know, angels don't exist, and then suddenly angels do exist. That's a weird experience. And here's H.P. Lovecraft. You know, he's a person that we should take with a pinch of salt because of his, you know, lots of people have commented on his racism and all of that kind of stuff. But he also has some interesting points to make about the weird. You know, his whole life was spent creating weird stories. So he said, the true weird tale has got something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains, according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. Heavy, but it's cosmic. This is what he's saying. He's also thought of as the founder of cosmic horror. You know, this feeling of being small and insignificant in a vast cosmos. Okay, so it's definitely linked, this feeling, to the idea of the mysterium horrendum that Rudolf Otto talked about. So the interesting thing about these stories that H.P. Lovecraft wrote, I've written a chapter about it in this book on theology and horror, is that, and also in the films that have tried to replicate it, is that, in, you know, like I was saying, in order to be good, it has to actually invoke that feeling of the weird in you. So almost reading like an H.P. Lovecraft story or an Arthur Machen story, or even Dracula I talk about as well, you know, it's effective because it makes us feel the weird. And we get a shudder. we get a sudden feel of that primal feeling response that Rudolf Otto was talking about. And obviously this is also precisely the kind of feeling that we have in all sorts of crazy paranormal experiences as well as in mystical visions and encounters with divine beings and stuff. So another related feeling response that's been noted in, amongst all of these different kinds of paranormal and extraordinary experiences is the Oz factor. And this is a term that was coined by Jenny Randalls. She's been a long time kind of UFO and alien abduction researcher, has written about time slips and all sorts of really interesting stuff. She's not an academic, so she's free to explore these things from a whole range of different perspectives. But one of the things that she noticed when looking at all of these experiences was this, again, common kind of feeling response, a feeling that people have, either at the onset of these experiences or as a consequence of them. So she describes the Oz factor as a set of symptoms which create the impression of temporarily having left our material world and entered another dreamlike place with magical rules. It tells us most notably that the percipient has changed their state of consciousness. The result is a dreamy and weirdly silent state of mind that is recognized as peculiar, even though they do not appreciate what it implies. So again, it's this sort of state of consciousness of being in a new place, really. A novel experience. There's no sound, but you're kind of weirdly calm. It's got that dual nature to it. It's freaky, but you also kind of like it. And that's kind of like what Rudolf Otto was talking about with the numinous. So, the Oz factor, the weird, and the numinous, all of these different labels seem to be talking about some kind of a similar feeling that we have in certain situations. And you could say that this feeling is either, we could think of it as a trigger. Maybe we need to be in a particular state of consciousness in order to have these kinds of experiences. Or it could work the other way around as well, that this feeling, and this is kind of what Rudolf Otto was getting at, is a consequence of our interaction with the whole, the other. Okay. Probably actually it's a bit of both, which is usually the case. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. So now I've got a couple of examples that I just want to have a look at of high strangeness experiences. And we'll think about some of these phenomenological similarities that we've been talking about, these kinds of key points. So here's where I'll mention the Men in Black. So the Men in Black, they started to turn up. Well, the people have suggested that the Men in Black have been turning up, forever. We look in the Bible, there are strange people in black who turn up sometimes, interpreted in weird, all sorts of different ways. Right? So the suggestion that this is a phenomenon that has been always with us, but in the way that it pans out today, really started off in the sort of 1940s and 1950s, when the UFO thing started to really get into its stride. And what would happen is, people who had seen a UFO, maybe they'd just seen a light in the sky. So what would start off as a very low strangeness experience will then be visited by a strange man in black. There are also accounts of women in black as well, of a strange person in black then, who comes to the door and then asks strange questions, or they are intimidating and they say, you shouldn't be researching this, or you shouldn't be looking into UFOs, things like that. And often they get the impression is that they are kind of like government officials or that kind of thing, but there's no no official documentation, no badges or anything like that. Okay, so as this wasn't strange enough, the actual characteristics of these men in black are pretty weird, the descriptions that we get of them. So there's a really this is a nice drawing from one of the first people who to talk about this, a guy called Bender. But this was a phenomenon that was recognized by people like John Keel, the Fortean writers, people who were well embedded in the UFO research community, had their own interactions with the men in black and described them. But not taken seriously by academics, except for in the work of this folklorist, Peter Rockovitz. And one of the interesting things about Peter Rockovitz, and he's agreed to contribute a chapter to the Deep Weird book that I'm putting together, is that he had his own, men in black experience as well. So he approaches this phenomenon not just as, a folklorist would, as a system of beliefs and narratives, but also as a distinctive kind of extraordinary experience, with its own distinctive features, but obviously also features that relate it back to other kinds of extraordinary experiences again. So here's how he describes the men in black. He says, they're often dressed in black clothing that may appear soiled and generally unkempt, or unrealistically neat and wrinkle-free. Men in black have on occasion displayed a very unusual walking motion, moving about as if their hips were swivel joints, producing a gliding or rocking effect, often with the torso and legs seemingly moving off into opposite directions. So these guys move around very strangely. Other descriptions of them, they're always very, very pale, or they have lipstick that's been applied really, vigorously. But it's almost as though these people, or whatever they are, have got some idea of the way that human beings do things, the way that human beings dress, but it's always slightly off, the way that human beings move. If they're offered food and drink, again, they very often don't know what to do with it. They can't do it, or it has a weird effect on them. There's all sorts of strange things about these men in black that links them in with other forms of extraordinary experience. And also the way that they turn up either before or after an event. This is what makes me think that the weird person coming to clean the carpets in that scenario, she mentioned that for a reason. Was it for some reason, a trigger for the event? Okay, so we can say then that these kinds of encounters, and if you are interested in them, there's plenty of stuff that you can read about the men in black, but they've got a very high strangeness rating. They're often really surreal interactions. They evoke this idea of the numinous again, because they're so bizarre. They're both frightening. The experiences will describe them as both frightening but also fascinating. This is such an unusual thing to see, someone behaving in such a strange way. You kind of you're intrigued by it, but at the same time, it's really repulsive. This is why I'll just tell you why I put the picture of the toad's eye at the beginning of this presentation, because I had a similar experience or a realization of this dual numinous mysterium tremendum fascinans thing while I was looking at a toad and looking into its eye, and I realized that there was something about the toad that was very familiar to me. It was a living being. It had eyes and a face, essentially, and all of that kind of stuff, very familiar stuff. And then there's also stuff about the toad that is very other and alien, living under the ground, squirming around in soil and eating slugs and things like that. That is actually repulsive for me as a human being anyway, in a particular human being, looking at it. I was at once drawn in by the toad and fascinated by it, and could see similarities between myself and the toad, and also see vast differences that really freaked me out. I wouldn't want to be a toad as I am now. So it's a similar kind of thing with the men in black, or with any of these kinds of experiences, and especially with the experience I'm going to tell you now, where people are drawn to it, but also very afraid of it. Okay. These kinds of experiences, as you might expect, men in black experiences particularly, are frequently ignored. And Rockovitz points out in his paper that the reason that they're ignored is because they're so weird. It exceeds people's Boggle thresholds. So even in folklore, which deals with people's contemporary people's ideas and beliefs around these things. It's a fringy kind of subject area again. Okay, but once again, if we look at it from this comparative perspective and think about, the encounters with angelic beings or whatever, encounters with aliens, the kinds of encounters with spirits of the dead or encounters with fairies, then there are so many parallels and crossovers that it kind of, to my mind anyway, ignoring that is to the detriment of our understanding of extraordinary experiences. Okay, so there are lots of motifs in these experiences that connect them to other religious experiences. So this experience that I want to mention now, this was sent to me by, I'll call him my informant, who was looking, basically he wanted some help to try and make sense of an experience that he and his friend had had while they were walking in the wilderness not far from his friend's home. This took place in America. And basically him and his friend had gone out the back of the house. They'd walked down, down the garden basically and out into the wilderness. And this is what he said. And, I've highlighted, you can see, put things in bold here that resonate with all of these themes that we've been talking about, which makes me think that this experience, again, like Mike Cleland said, is a genuine experience at the very least. So he says, both of us immediately saw something out of place. We've got this idea of the wholly other. Below, about 30 to 40 feet away from us in between the trees, there was something tall, white, and three-dimensional. It appeared to be completely white and soft like light, but it did not illuminate the trees or ground around it. It was shaped in an upside-down V or U. It was so white that you could see the shadow being cast on it while it was swaying like it was a real animal. So here's his picture of this thing that he'd seen. He calls it a night crawler. But he didn't see it moving. It was doing this weird swaying motion in a clearing of trees. Okay, he goes on. It was making creepy swaying movements with its whole body. It was moving left to right in a specific motion, standing on the forest floor in the same area between the trees, making absolutely no sound. And there was absolutely no wind. It was beautiful to look at, but terrifying at the same time. We watched it in silence as it was swaying, and I started to feel impending doom. The sinking feeling in your chest set in, and it felt like I was going to die or something bad was going to happen. I told my friend specifically, I don't like this. He agreed, and we immediately left the forest. So, crazy experience. And if you didn't know anything about, extraordinary experiences, religious experiences, mystical experiences more generally, then you might disregard this as being, this might not pass through your Boggle threshold, because it is really weird. There is no animal that we know of that looks like this. It's a pretty weird shape for an animal. And all of this other weird stuff, the no wind, no sound. But as we've been looking at, all of this actually fits perfectly into what we know about how these experiences kind of pan out. So they recognize something out of place. This is what Rudolf Otto was talking about, when we confront the wholly other. And we have this feeling response into something that is alien, essentially, to us. He talks about it being completely white and soft like light. I'll see in a minute that there are, light is a major component of paranormal experiences, mystical experiences across the board. Whether we're talking about a UFO experience as a light in the sky, a ghostly apparition as an illuminated body in a room or whatever, light is always involved. Obviously we have to see as well, so light is going to be involved in these experiences. But the way that light behaves in paranormal experiences is particularly strange. Okay, so it's a soft light. It doesn't illuminate the trees or the ground. It's like the object itself is emitting the light, or the object itself is light. It's making these creepy swaying movements, which to my mind, reminded me a little bit of the Men in Black and this weird rocking movement, gliding motion that they have. It's freaky. Making absolutely no sound, obviously, is the Oz factor, the fact that there was no wind. The animals, everything goes silent during these experiences. And this is probably one of the most common, features of UFO encounters. So this is clearly not a UFO, or certainly not a flying, like a nuts and bolts spacecraft. And then the best bit for me was the total Rudolf Otto Mysterium Tremendum, Mysterium Fascinans moment, where he explicitly says that it was beautiful to look at, but terrifying at the same time. If you read The Wind in the Willows, there's a chapter in The Piper at the Gates of Dawn where Ratty and Mole see Pan appear to them, and they describe the encounter with Pan in exactly the same terms as being both beautiful but also extremely frightening. So this is really interesting. It doesn't tell us necessarily what this thing is, but it does tell us that the experience that they had in that context, which has been troubling for this guy, and he's doing a lot of reading around it and trying to make sense of it. But, and he said this to me when I wrote about this in this paper, to have it taken seriously, in an academic context and looked at, and to be seen to have these connections with a whole range of what are essentially normal experiences. They're not pathological. All sorts of people have these experiences, and it brings also comfort to people. So it's important work. Anyway, so this is a very bizarre encounter, but it does have all these similarities with other experiences. So, like I've said, the numinous weird Oz factor, the sense of presence, like Beardsworth was talking about, the being of light, the unusual behavior of the light. Mark Fox did a study of orbs, or experiences of orbs in the Religious Experience Research Centre archive. So experiences with balls of light that behave in strange ways. And Anna Katrina Pula did a great book about encounters with light, transforming encounters with light, where people have visions or interactions with beings of light that change their lives in all sorts of different ways, or heal them and things like that. The creepy swaying movements were like the weird movements of the MIB, and the growth, the feeling of impending doom, and the mysterium horrendum was just very vividly described, almost word for word, perfectly. So all of that, we take Mike Clelland's suggestion of looking at the complexity of the experience, suggests that there's something going on with that experience. So this is where I'm going to start to wrap up by thinking about how we can approach this kind of stuff, or how can we bring it into the academic discourse that we've got going on. And there's three things that I'm going to talk about. There are probably other things that I could talk about as well. But one of them is the idea of Charles Fort's idea of dominance. So he had this idea of a dominant way before Thomas Kuhn and his idea of the paradigms. Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions was published in 1963 or something. And the idea was that basically science progresses through revolutions, as information or data builds up that challenges a model. Eventually, there's a revolution and a paradigm shift, and a new science emerges. Well, Charles Fort was talking about this, in the early 1900s, but he termed it differently. Instead of a paradigm, he called them a dominant, and he talked about how these dominants rise and fall in science and in culture over and over again. Okay, so this is what he means. He says, in our acceptance, dominants in their succession displace preceding dominants, not only because they are more nearly positive, so not only because they are more true, but because the old dominants as recruiting mediums play out. Our expression is that the new dominant of wider inclusions is now manifesting throughout the world, and that the old exclusionism is everywhere breaking down. So Charles Fort was very obviously thinking way ahead He was thinking forward to a time when science would take seriously all of this weird paranormal data that he'd collected, thinking to a paradigm or a dominant of inclusion, of including as much as possible rather than excluding stuff. Okay, so this is a cool idea. You know, it's very similar to the idea of a paradigm, that there might be a new paradigm emerging under the weight of all of this new data building up. So I think this, you know, has this new paradigm actually emerged yet? Not quite. Nearly, maybe a little bit. Okay, but he was envisioning this, he called it an inclusive science. He actually called it witchcraft. He said that the new dominant of inclusivity will be a dominant of witchcraft. And he had his own meaning of what witchcraft entails, but essentially it was a shift, a big shift in the way that we think about the relation of mind and body and all of these kinds of things. He talked about not thinking in terms of mind, how mind and body interact, but thinking how mind, body, and body-mind interact with each other. So totally breaking down that kind of assumption. So he was really ahead in a lot of ways thinking about this. And I think one way that we can move forward and to maybe start to bring about this new inclusive science of extraordinary experiences is to bring in, you know, this high strangeness stuff as well, or at least to engage with it. I'm not saying that everyone has to, you know, go into this stuff. You can still research, you know, prayer and things as well, but admit that it's kind of there. Okay, so, you know, we could ask, are we moving closer to or further away from this new dominant of inclusion? I think there are some things that suggest that we are moving closer towards it, but there are also parallel things that suggest the opposite. And, you know, like the closure of humanities departments and things like that is one of the things that makes me a little bit less optimistic about the way that the future might pan out for these kinds of subjects, and especially the way that these kind of things are talked about and taught in schools as well. But that's another thing. So I've tried to imagine what a Fortean religious studies might actually look like. And I did a book in 2016 called Damned Facts, an edited book with lots of interesting chapters in it from different contributors. But I tried to, in my introduction, to explore what a Fortean religious studies might look like. And what some of the things that it might do are to shift away from thinking about beliefs and culture and social structures and all of those kind of things, which are kind of like the bread and butter of the social sciences and humanities, and start to think more in terms of like religious phenomena or religious events or objects or, you know, experiences, things, religious things, you know, as actual things, not as just beliefs. Okay, so that's one way that we might be able to bring this stuff into the academy, by basically bringing about a new paradigm. It's not easy. Another way is to think about alternative ways of thinking about the mind, for example. So I really love this idea of Gothic psychology. It was a term that William James basically coined in an obituary to Frederick Myers, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. And Myers had this, his psychology was complex. Myers came up with the idea of the subliminal and the supraliminal mind. And so there are at least two parts of our mind. But he also went on to explain that, you know, our mind actually reaches out beyond our body and all of this kind of stuff. So it's a Gothic, you know, like it's intricate view of psychology. It's not neat. So this is what William James said, and obviously William James can explain it better than me. He said their work, and he's talking about these psychical researchers, their work is like going from classic to Gothic architecture, where few outlines are pure and where uncouth forms lurk in the shadows. A mass of mental phenomena are now seen in the shrubbery beyond the parapet. Fantastic, ignoble, hardly human or frankly non-human are some of these new candidates for psychological description. The world of the mind is shown as something infinitely more complex than was suspected. and whatever beauties it may still possess, it has lost at any rate the beauty of academic neatness. But then he goes on to say, but despite the triumph of romanticism, psychologists as a rule have still some lingering prejudice in favor of the nobler simplicities. So, this is the same situation today. The mainstream is interested in these nobler simplicities, but all of this stuff is what's really going on. The Gothic psychology, the interaction between ourselves and the world outside of ourselves. And I love this bringing in of the non-human into psychology. So, perhaps we could use this then as another starting point for engaging with high strangeness, starting from a very different conception of the mind, not as an individual or as bounded or anything like that, but actually as fundamentally interconnected with all other living things and also potentially other strange non-human things as well. So this is where my own idea of ontological flooding comes in, and I called it ontological flooding, but really it's the same kind of thing as people like William James are talking about with pragmatism and that kind of stuff. But basically the idea is, this is the idea that I came to from my PhD research with mediums in Bristol, was that we're dealing with something that is very complex and that has multiple contributing factors in any given situation or any particular phenomenon or experience. So I'll use mediumship as the example, but mediumship is, people would like to have tended to try to explain mediumship away in terms of like a cognitive framework, it's all to do with weird cognitive category errors and stuff like that. Or it's been explained in terms of psychopathology or brain damage or whatever, or as a symptom of schizophrenia. All of these, and there are loads of them, reductionist explanations. So the fact that there are so many reductionist explanations suggests to me that no single one of them actually is correct. No single one of those explanations can account for the true complexity of this experience. And actually, if we want to understand the experience in all of its complexity, then not only do we need to take into account all of that stuff. So I'm not saying that the brain isn't involved, or that cognitive processes are not involved, or that sometimes mediumship does perform a social function. Obviously, of course, it does all of that stuff as well, but there is more potentially going on as well. There's more, it's almost like, it's more than the sum of its parts, essentially. These kinds of experiences can't be explained just in terms of brain function or just in terms of whatever, drugs or anything like that. So what ontological flooding then does is moves away from the idea that any single reductive explanation can account for any given experience or phenomenon. And actually, you're going to need at least, at least two perspectives, but probably many, many more in order to understand anything. You can't just, it's not, you can't just bonk a label onto things. The real world is much more complicated. So this is how I've explained it in a paper a few years ago. I should also say that this idea of ontological flooding is a kind of like, it's also a reaction to bracketing in phenomenology, where in phenomenological research, you bracket out questions of ontology. You don't ask whether the beliefs or whatever that you're investigating relate to anything real. That's not your question. And most social sciences operate on that basic assumption that you're not really interested in whether astrology is real or not. You're only interested in how people do astrology or what people believe about astrology. So you bracket out the question of reality. But I say, rather than bracketing out questions of ontology for fear that they might lead to truths, so like damned facts in Forte's terms, things that don't fit in, that cannot fit into the established order of Western academia's dominant ontology, I suggest that we essentially open the floodgates of ontological possibilities. This places really all of these ontologies on an equal footing. So, the dominant ontology in Western science is like kind of like a materialism, isn't it? But if we do this ontological flooding, we say that that is just one amongst many possible interpretations. So this places all ontologies on an equal footing, so that while ontological bracketing protects and reinforces the mainstream consensus reality, what we might call ontological flooding destabilizes it and opens it up to questioning, exploration, and expansion. So, to conclude, high strangeness was introduced into the discourse of paranormal research as a scientific term by a scientist, Alan Hynek. It was his framework for making sense of some of these complex, extraordinary experiences and for a way of categorizing them and trying to study them. Okay, so as such, it might have broader usefulness in the study of extraordinary and religious experiences. So there's that. We could use that idea, in our academic research. But it also encourages us to take seriously all those elements of extraordinary experiences that might actually seem bizarre or absurd, or that we might try to ignore or brush to the side, and to try to understand them in their comparative context. And then if we can do this, then it might go some way towards helping to bridge the gap between these different fields of research on extraordinary experience, between religious studies researchers, and parapsychologists, and then also the Fortean writers as well. And also to show that these threads, the threads run in both directions. The religious experience themes that are well established run right into the paranormal, just in the same way that those paranormal themes also run straight into the established religious and mystical experience research. Okay, so high strangeness then might actually not be a feature of just outlying cases or extreme extraordinary encounters, but it might actually be a feature that runs throughout all sorts of extraordinary experiences. And maybe it's actually high strangeness that makes an experience extraordinary or religious or mystical in the first place, that you're somehow interacting with or participating in that complexity. So that's it. And there's some references there. I'll stop sharing my screen. I think I've gone over, haven't I?
Yes, I think you have. And thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fantastic, Jack. That we've really enjoyed it. I'm sure